Hello, today I'm going to show you how I clean the sump of my Red Sea Reefer 250. Hello and welcome back everyone to Amrazul TV. First and foremost, thank you so much for 5,000 subs. It's really amazing how much the channel has grown over this past year, and I really appreciate all of the help and support. So today's video is going to be about sump cleanup. I realized that I haven't made a video about my process of cleaning my sump, and I do this every 6 months or twice a year. And with COVID and staying home, I thought I might have a little fun and actually show you my process. So I'm going to take you through all the different steps that I do to clean up the equipment in my Red Sea Reefer 250. So first I make about a gallon of citric acid. I used to use vinegar, but there's some issues of vinegar causing magnets to swell up, so I now move to citric acid. The first thing that I do is I remove the skimmer and put it in this empty brute container, and I'll get to the skimmer later. The first order of business is to get the heater and my return pump out. And before I disconnect the heater and the return pump, I put a temporary heater in the display. And while the return pump is off, I still continue the circulation from my power head, so that way I make sure that my tank is going to be at the same temperature and will be oxygenated during the lengthy cleanup process, which takes approximately 3 to 4 hours. So first I removed my Fenix heater. This is a titanium heater, which I really like. I think it's got a very low profile. I don't have to worry about breaking glass. Then I remove my apex probes. If you see me pulling from the wire there, obviously pulling from the wire of one probe would be bad, but I try to kind of hold all the wire bundled together. Then I make sure that the next step is to remove the union. My Vectra is hard plumbed, and it's got a union in and a union out, so I remove this connecting area that feeds my fuge. And once that's out of the way, I make sure that all the wires and probes are out of the tank, so it makes removing the pump easier. And once the pump is out of the way, I have it soak it right now in the citric acid. The next step is removing my fuge. So I have the fuge light I clip on, I move it out of the way. There's a little float valve that tells me if the fuge overflows. I remove that gently, and I just make sure that all the wires are kind of out of the way before trying to drain the fuge and remove it completely. So first I drain the fuge, the water, into just a 5-gallon bucket, and I remove the Chato ball. That's what my dirty sump looks like. You see there's like a lot of buildup of detritus, especially in return chamber. And if you look, this is, I forgot what we call this, but this is where the water kind of comes from the display. And you see it's got all of these really cool like microorganisms and tube worms, and I think it really helps with filtering my water. So after I remove the bags of, I have like Secam matrix, I have a bag of Ciprax, and I have a bag of carbon. So once I move these out of the way, I essentially clean the sump itself, the water in the sump itself, using like a self-cleaning cycle. So I use one of these inline pumps to take water from the sump and pump it through a fresh pair of filter socks and then back. So the water just kind of cycles through the filter. First, I try to actually hand siphon or siphon with the pump a lot of the areas where detritus has accumulated. And after I do that for a while, I put a big Tunzi power head there, and that just creates a lot of water movement in the sump and puts all the detritus in solution for the inline pump to pick it up and move the detritus to the filter socks. And I keep this running for 2 or 3 hours while I pay attention to the other equipment that needs cleaning. So first I try to run the return pump in the citric acid for maybe 15-20 minutes, and then I let it soak for another hour and a half. I also like to soak all the probes in my tank. That includes the apex probes, the sensors, the optical and float sensors. These are the sensors of my Tunzi, the optical and float sensor of the Tunzi. And it's always a good idea to get them kind of clean. You don't want to have any detritus on the surfaces, and that could cause false readings of your sensors. And you can see even just with about half an hour, the water in the sump is already starting to clear up, so that's good. I occasionally, if I see that there's some detritus buildup in some of the corners, I try to stir it up manually using the sturkey baster. I take this time to disassemble my skimmer and put all the pumps and the motor in the citric acid well and leave that soaking. And you can see after about 2 hours, the water in the sump is noticeably cleaner. And so by that time, it's when I start turning my attention to actually cleaning the return pump itself. I try to get the return pump back in the system as fast as possible. So the Vectra is actually fairly easy to take apart and clean. There's only like 4 screws, and there's no friction fits. Everything just disassembles completely, which allows me to take it apart and give it a really thorough clean. This is what it looks like after I've been cleaning it. So basically it comes out of the citric acid, and I just brush it with a toothbrush, get all the surfaces, all the grime out, and it does clean up really nicely. And then once I'm happy with the cleanup, I put it back together, and there it is assembled just like new. And then it's ready to go back in the tank. So I put the Tanzi sensors, the ape, back in the system. I put the clean heater back after it's been again scrubbed with a toothbrush. That's me kind of placing it where I usually put it in the sump section of, skimmer section of my sump. You can see the zipper racks in the little baggies that I have in the sump there. And here the skimmer is in position. It's sitting on a couple of silicone mats just to kind of reduce any vibration. Before I make the final collection, I get the clean fuge, and effectively the fuge, I just kind of scrape it with one of those scrapers that you clean the glass with, and then refill it back with water. And once the fusion is placed, then I add the little union, the 2 unions, and the PVC that connect the return to the display, and it also has this extra outlet that feeds my my fuge. You know that obviously if there was a lot of water flowing through to the fuge, I would have to make kind of more sturdier connections, but really just a trickle of water, so I'm not worried too much about anything leaking. That's why you see that there's kind of nothing, no tie downs for these connections, but I haven't had an issue with that. And then once I have the apex probe back in position, that's a time where essentially the sump is now fully functional again, with the exception of the skimmer. So I go ahead and I turn on the return pump, and just to kind of make sure that it's still working, and also making sure that I didn't introduce any possible water leaks. So sometimes when you are unscrewing the return section, you might like wiggle the tube a little bit, and you might get some leaking water. So I take this time to kind of just inspect everything and make sure that there is no leaks in my system. And with the return pump back online, I now take the time to disassemble my skimmer, the pump, and make sure everything is kind of squeaky clean before I put it back together. I really like the Red Sea skimmer, but the pump is a little bit difficult to disassemble. It requires a little bit of force to remove the cover and get at the impeller. And so here's the sump all ready to go, and it's already making some bubbles. And I take this time to make sure that all the connections, all the tubes in my tank are in the right place. So this is my alk line and my RODI line. I make sure that they're tight and they're delivering water in the correct place. This is my calcium line. Yeah, it goes into the refugium. And I also double check that my automatic water changing line, so this is the line that brings new salt water in, and it's in the right place. And I make sure that the water that removes dirty salt water from my sump into the basement is also in the right place. I double check all the connections on my dosing, my doser, just to, sometimes when you're working in the sump, you could knock off a line or knock off a collection that could cause leakage. So I just make sure that the dosing lines are nice and tight, and they're connecting to the dosing containers. And I also double check all of the float switch, so my breakout box, my optical Apex optical sensor box and just double check everything. And I also take this time to go ahead and test some of the float valves. So I'm going to test here the float valve that is meant to shut off the return pump and the skimmer if the water gets too high in the fuse. And so I manually engage the float switch, and within a few seconds the return pump is off, and you can see here that the skimmer is also turned off. Then I remove I turn my attention to the power head, so I remove my two gyres or gearies, and I leave them soaking in citric acid. And then I actually take the time to thoroughly clean the glass. So I have two types of glass cleaner, the Tansy glass cleaner and the flipper. I find the Tansy to be a little bit more kind of heavy duty if you want to cut through some coralline. But the problem with the Tansy is that it doesn't float, and sometimes if you hit like a patch of coralline, then the part that's in the water falls in the sand, and it's difficult to retrieve. The flipper, I actually, it's not as heavy duty, but it floats, and I never had that issue of kind of losing the flipper. So most of the time I use a flipper, except when I need to like push through some coralline, I use the Tansy. And just as I was shooting this, the Tansy did its thing, and it kind of fell off. I was trying to clear a heavy patch of coralline, and it just caught an edge and it fell in the tank, which is a big pain in the ass. Alright, here's what the tank looks like after the glass is all clean and the gyres are clean and the sump is clean. Corals look happy, fish are happy. I don't actually clean the MP10s at the same time I clean the gyres. It's a little bit too much to do in one single day. So I alternate every monthly. I either clean the MP10s or the gyres, and the sump gets cleaned every 6 months. Alright guys, that's it. Thank you so much for watching. Again, thanks for the 5K. It's really cool to see the channel growing. And I will see you soon with more regular reef updates, and I'm working on a couple of other reef science videos. Alright, have a good one. Bye.